September 7, 100. In the dim light, I was studying the navigation charts in the central station room. I was so absorbed in planning to go to sea that I shuddered when I heard the XO's voice. The submarine is ready to leave port. The team is in place. Thank you. Now close all bulkhead hatches and put on life jackets. When we cross the bay, only 2 or 3 men should remain in the hull. The watertight doors clicked, and the submariners donned their yellow life jackets. I pulled on my sheepskin jacket, followed the crew to the running bridge, and commanded in a muffled voice, "Give up fore and aft. Both engines at full speed, reverse gear, straight to the rudder." The submarine quietly moved away from the pier and slipped into the bay from the concrete shelter stern forward. We passed the first 300 meters in the night darkness. No one noticed us leaving. Stop car. Small forward. 20 left. New course 20 to 80. I steered the boat toward the center of the channel between the 2 islands. For the last time I looked at the ghostly haze of La Rochelle, which soon shared the fate of Brest and other ports besieged by the Allies. The boat was moving across the dark surface of the bay. The last of the wolves was leaving its lair. It was hard to part with this shore, from where we carried the German flag across the 7 seas. I had the feeling that all my previous campaigns, all our great sacrifices had been in vain. As the vague outlines of the shore disappeared over the horizon, and the boat entered the neck of the bay, the height of the tide was at its highest. Ahead on the starboard side, the slender tower of the lighthouse on Oleron Island showed us the way through the night fog. To starboard, the shadows, destroyers bearing 3 to 40. At this point, 6 enemy ships, barely visible in the open sea, came at us. The radar pulses, however, did not disturb us, nor were we detected by their shore artillery. When the bearing taken on the ghostly beacon on the port side showed 20 degrees, I changed course and steered the boat south. U-953 moved slowly, using the black shoreline as cover. After the lighthouse disappeared, I risked starting the diesels. As soon as they began to smoke exhaust fumes, the boat picked up speed. We were traveling 10 miles along the visible coast of the shore, under the constant threat of being intercepted by the enemy. But, as I had anticipated, the enemy's patrol boats had withdrawn with the onset of dawn, so as not to run the risk of being fired upon by our shore batteries. I then steered the boat into the open sea. When the stars went out in the sky, U-953 went underwater. Now we parted from the shore of the Bay of Biscay forever. At sunset of the 2nd day of our trip, a storm broke out. A strong wind drove a high wave that covered our schnorkel. The air supply to the boat hull was often interrupted, and a vacuum appeared in it, which led to suffocation. It literally made our heads split open. But despite the raging storm, I felt great. Under the protection of the 14-meter water column and the strong swell of the sea, it was almost impossible to pick us up. It had been a long time since I had been in such a safe environment, the trouble of using the schnorkel being offset by the reduced threat of air attack. During these hours of stealthy movement, our radio operators, with the highest vigilance, were engaged in deciphering radiograms from headquarters concerning U-953 and several other wolves still afloat. While in the central station room, I found in the stream of radiograms and the order for our new operation. It was that our boat, together with U-484 and U-743, was to engage in patrolling on the western approaches to the northern strait. U-953 was ordered to provide the extreme southern flank of this boundary. At the end of the session of transmission of orders of operational content, headquarters told us a summary of the latest communiques of the Wehrmacht High Command. They spoke of heavy fighting and our losses in western and southern France. The British deployed a powerful offensive in Belgium. The Americans came to the line Namur-Orleans. We learned also that Franco-British troops were moving northward along the Rhone River, and that the Soviets were ready to enter our eastern lands. Other reports, also depressing, spoke of bombing of Germany by numerous squadrons of Allied bomber aircraft, which had leveled our cities and turned them into crematorium ovens. There was not a single piece of encouraging news, not the slightest hint of a halt in the pernicious development of events. On the night of September 10, a cable short circuit in the central station room brought us to the brink of disaster. Only the instant reaction of the chief engineer, who extinguished the fire with gloved hands, saved us from an emergency surfacing fraught with death. U-953 was a steady course to the northwest, overcoming the vast expanse of the Bay of Biscay. The sea surface was ruffled by strong fall winds, which made it difficult to use the schnorkel. In the early hours of September 11, just after we had passed the 8th degree of west longitude, our centrifugal pump failed, and without it we lost the ability to maintain our ability to stay afloat in an emergency. Non-commissioned Officer Berger, the chief mechanic, took the pump apart and fiddled with it until sundown until it worked. On September 13, shortly after midnight, the bad news that came from headquarters concerned me personally. What I had long feared had happened. Darmstadt, where my parents' new home was located, had been heavily bombed. The air raid, which took place last night, wiped out the center of the city. Tens of thousands of citizens were killed. Many thousands were left homeless. My parents, who had moved to the city, despite my objections, had apparently lost all their possessions again, something more tragic I didn't want to think about. I hoped they had taken refuge in the nearest bomb shelter. The next day, U-953 set a course to the northwest, following the continental shelf. Our movement underwater had not yet been impeded by anything, as we were away from the harbor. We trusted the schnorkel exactly as much as its absence was bringing other submarines to ruin. September 16. 40 minutes after midnight, the starboard diesel suddenly stalled. We began to be haunted by accidents. When the chief mech returned from the stern, his frowning face expressed alarm. A bushing in the diesel had burst. Damn that old junk. A sudden gasp prevented our conversation. The float got stuck in the schnorkel and air access to the hull stopped. The left diesel sucked out almost all the air left in it before it was shut down. The submariners were breathing convulsively with their eyes rolling out of their orbits. The chief engineer lowered the boat underwater in hopes of freeing the schnorkel from the float. However, the maneuver had no effect. Breathing became even more difficult. The chief engineer gesticulated desperately, trying to encourage his assistants to lower the schnorkel tube in order to clear the jam. The mechanics frantically pulled levers, pulled the pipe by grasping the cable, then lifted it with a simple jack. Agonizing minutes passed. Then the pipe was freed from the jam and seawater rushed into the bottom with a sound that resembled gargling. The float popped out of the pipe with a pop, and it began to suck air inside. The sudden change in pressure hit many a man's eardrums. Unable to bear the pain, the sailors slumped to the deck plates and frantically gulped air to equalize the pressure. Mishaps and breakdowns continued to haunt the boat. On the night of September 17, attempts to keep the boat at the depth of schnorkel in the conditions of the raging sea and the work of one diesel engine caused a lot of nervous tension. Glavma tried for hours to charge our batteries, but this was prevented by the strong swell, because of which the float was constantly stuck in the tube of the schnorkel. Then, without any warning, the boat broke freed from the control of my experienced chief engineer. From the diesel compartment came the splash of water. The boat settled sharply aft and went down at a high angle, completely out of control. With desperate determination, the chief engineer tried to stop the boat's sinking at a depth of 285 meters, and after several incredible efforts it was brought back under control. The cause of the water intrusion into the diesel compartment remained a mystery. Apparently, it had somehow gotten inside the boat through the air intake pipe of the schnorkel. Over 20 tons of water had accumulated in the bottom of the diesel compartment, and 5 more in the pipe itself. After the pipe came out of there, we tried the schnorkel again, but instead of air through it, new streams of water rushed into the boat, forcing it to continue the dive, fraught with disaster. There was no doubt. Our schnorkel was incapacitated. The situation was becoming dire. We were faced with a choice: either suffocate underwater or rise to the surface of the sea, where we could be destroyed by the enemy. I chose surfacing. In this case, there was a slim chance to reach the coast of Ireland, and hiding between the rocks, to correct the malfunction. I changed the boat's course from northwest to east and raised her to the surface of the stormy sea. The gunners rushed to their automatic guns. The two engine men removed the grills from the deck and hid in the space between the light and strong hulls to find out the cause of the malfunction. The left engine roared loudly and dragged the boat through hurricane-force winds, crashing waves, and torrential downpour. The night was clearly out of the ordinary, but it kept the hunters in port. Since the weather favored us, I continued toward shore and fully recharged the batteries. Before sunset, we went underwater without adventure. Glavma reported a malfunction that the motorists had discovered. A damaged hidden flange in the air intake had been torn off. Installation of the new flange could not begin until the evening. We spent another night on the surface of the stormy sea, saving us from pursuit. Finally, after 2 hours of repair work under the blows of the sea waves, the motorists installed a new flange and completely recharged the batteries. After such incredible luck, U-953 dived under a wave of 20 meters high. The next night at 23.18, we noticed the light of a lighthouse on the Irish coast, peacefully blinking at us from afar. After consulting with the XO at the periscope, I decided it was Loop Lighthouse near the mouth of the River Shannon. 40 minutes after midnight, during our regular acoustic listening, we heard the bursting of depth bombs in the area of the sea we had crossed the previous night. The British were back to hunting for subs. Motorists began to disassemble the right diesel engine and repair its bushing. We in the bow compartments concentrated on keeping the boat at schnorkel depth underwater. During these dangerously tense hours, short radiograms and news reached us. Headquarters was pressing the few lone wolves to follow the Norwegian ports along the boundary line 200 meters from the Irish shore. Observations of the situation, however, led me to suspect a leak in our security system, which made the British destroyers go to that line first. Nearly half a dozen subs challenged the superior Allied forces, and all but 2 of them were lost. At the central station room, I received a distress radiogram duplicated by headquarters. Bombed. Tonum. 62 SS. 01 WDU 800 and 67. A little later came another distress radiogram from the same area. Defect in the schnorkel. We are attacked from the air. We can't dive. U-865. This was the last radio program of the boat. It was sunk by an airplane before dawn. Later in the night came the news that the fortress of Brest had fallen after a 4-week siege. I thought of Captain Winter, who must have done his best to defend the city. Then my thoughts drifted to Darmstadt. How was my family? A year ago, I would have been informed of this. Then Dennett still kept in touch with his captains, informing them of good and bad events at home. But those days are irrevocably gone. Suddenly, the helmsman's voice came from the deckhouse. It's impossible to stay on course. The compass is out of order. I swore in impotent rage. Without a gyrocompass, it was extremely dangerous to continue the trip. It was impossible to use the spare magnetic compass. It hadn't been debugged since the boat had left Kiel a year ago, and it didn't inspire confidence. Finding myself in a desperate situation, I ordered to lie down on the ground. Berger disassembled the gyrocompass, warning several times that he had no idea how to put it back together again. All day long the sea around us was furrowed by enemy patrol ships. After 19 hours of continuous work, Berger still managed to assemble the device. On September 20 at dawn, I took a bearing from the lighthouse in Ishbofen. Then, expecting a meeting with the enemy, ordered to disconnect the schnorkel and led the boat at periscope depth. The noise from the pulses of the Aztec and rotating propellers of invisible ships increased. However, I saw only the airplane and the rocks of Clare Island. Then it came to me that we had been deceived by a new invention of the British. They scattered in the coastal waters sound buoys, imitating the noise of propellers and the rumble of explosions. Thus, the enemy hoped to lure our U-boats into the sea, where they could be Papalengovat watch ships and destroy. Encouraged by my discovery, I drove the boat at normal speed. The next night the sea calmed down and only false rumbles broke the silence. U-953 rounded Cape Ares and continued to Donegal Bay. At 03.08, the left diesel engine stalled. From the aft compartments came a brief message. Clutch jammed. Like a pirate, I cursed foully, jumped out of my corner, and replaced the chief engineer at the control station so he could look into the cause of the malfunction. He soon returned with unpleasant news. The clutch had to be dismantled. With 2 diesels idling, the boat continued to run on electric motors for another 3 hours, then lay on the ground in Sligo Bay. All day long the motorists, soiled with oil and fuel oil, labored with fanatical persistence under the scarcity of air. Our constant companions were the bursting of depth bombs over the western horizon and the noise of the thunderclap. An hour after midnight, both diesels were finally repaired, and U-953 broke away from the ground. The heavy rumble of bomb cluster explosions followed us as we traveled along the rocky coastline. Early in the morning, the lighthouse of Arran Island opened up, glittering in the sunshine. As night fell, I took bearing from Tory Island, whose cliffs towered over the ocean like snow-white cathedrals. At night, U-953 entered the northern strait. There was noticeable rapid activity of the British along the entire 200-meter coastline. We cautiously advanced at a depth of schnorkel from lighthouse to lighthouse, and by dawn reached the island of Innisfail. At 600 our submarine finally arrived at the hunting area. She lay in ambush on the rocky bottom of the northern strait, saving her strength for attacks. The rumble of explosions to the west continued unabated. Tommies were dropping clusters of depth charges as if they were low-value blocks of rock. The intensity of the bombardment again led me to suspect that the British had been informed of our march and were concentrating their forces here to deal with me and my partners. One late afternoon, a destroyer passed within 2 miles of us, bound for Londonderry Bay. Toward midnight we advanced at schnorkel depth to the east, penetrating farther and farther into the interior of the strait, where convoys were forced to follow in tight quarters. We cruised in the narrow passages for 3 hours, making cautious maneuvers, listening and probing our surroundings. Then we laid low again 13 miles east of Innisfail. Here, it seemed, was the perfect place to lay low and strike from ambush. The constant muffled murmur of explosions underwater from the west and the faint noise from the propellers of fast-moving destroyers testified to the powerful bombardment of the open sea. But none of the British captains had thought of the coastal narrows. They could have easily massacred us in the space between the shore and the nearest minefields. On the 3rd day of the boat's patrol in the strait, 2 destroyers passed us in the direction of the Irish Sea. I left the hunters unattended, expecting big game, which we estimated would soon appear. A premature attack would only reveal our presence and discourage surface vessels from entering the strait. This and the next 2 days were characterized by increased British activity along the 200-meter line, but no convoy passed through the strait. On September 29, after 7 days of fruitless waiting patrolling, U-953 suddenly broke off. Schnorkel turned our lives into a nightmare. Stormy wind rolled from the Atlantic to the coast of Ireland, huge waves. Glavmay made a dedicated effort to keep the boat underwater, but periodically the top of the tube schnorkel rose above the surface of 3 or 4 meters, allowing Tommy easily detect us. I saw no more sense in risking the death of the boat from enemy bombardment or collision with rocks, and decided to stop our agony. "That's enough for today, Chief Engineer. Lower her underwater." "The pipe is not moving," reported the mechanic, pulling the lever of the hoist. "The cable has broken. This damn thing is going nowhere." The new breakage posed a serious problem. If the boat got a strong trim, the tube could collapse and no amount of force would bring it back into place. This would mean the end of our underwater and any other existence. It was quite obvious, to our disappointment, that the boat was incapable of hunting. And yet we continued to be lucky. The tube held in place, allowing us to use the schnorkel. But now its massive and unreliable float of the device strongly protruded above the surface of the sea when we were at periscope depth and prevented a stealthy attack. The failure of the schnorkel crowned our campaign, which consisted of incessant troubleshooting. Although the crew deserved a prize for patience, I still decided to abort the patrol in the strait. With the schnorkel pipe sticking out ridiculously at a depth of 40 meters, U-953 set a course for her new base, the Norwegian port of Bergen. Overcoming strong underwater current, we crossed the strait diagonally, and maneuvering between minefields and British patrol groups, headed for the Hebrides Islands. At midnight on October 1, the diesels were still pulling the boat forward. Leaning in the central station room over the navigational chart table, I was composing a radiogram informing headquarters of our failure and planning a quick escape from the radio signal. At 100 hours, the radiogram was sent. It took only 4 letters of code to report. No convoy traffic in the strait. Powerful anti-submarine defense. Boat in a state of emergency. Return to base. U-953. My radiogram prompted the headquarters to request other submarines their assessment of the situation. 3 of our partners in the Northern Strait operation have not responded. U-484 and U-743 were destroyed by the British that same day less than 20 miles from us northwest of Instraal Island. U-925 was sunk near the coast of Ireland. My radiogram had other unpleasant consequences. At dawn, radar detected 3 destroyers approaching from the stern. I vowed not to use the radio transmitter again. Let the HQ guys guess what was going on. At 10:30, a new group of hunter ships was picked up. This time, ahead on the port side. We counted 6 destroyers furrowing the sea. They must have had squadrons of airplanes attached to help with the search. Soon the noise of radar pulses, engines running and propellers turning, filled all the compartments. Some submariners listened to it with eyes widened with fear. Others curled up in their bunks, pretending not to hear anything. The 6 Tommy ships were searching, probing the depths of the sea, unaware that we were rounding a minefield 3 miles east of them and only 20 meters from the surface. During the night, the noise moved to the stern and then went further out to sea. At midnight, we were disturbed by some ship, but after 2 hours it withdrew, and at 3:30 we breathed fresh air and rumbled the diesels to the surface. In a few days, U-953 passed the Hebrides Islands to the north. Their powerful gusts of autumn wind drove high waves. The submarine somehow managed to prolong its existence, despite the constant harassment of destroyers and frequent appearances of aircraft. During these weeks of endless emergency dives, the submariners received an unthinkable strain on their eardrums, eyesight, and lungs, but worse, they were alone with their secret thoughts. One could remember about carefree youth, school, triumphant offensive operations on land in the first years of the war, hundreds of sunk enemy ships and honors organized for us on this occasion, about women, love affairs. But remembering the past, it was impossible to stop bitter thoughts about defeats, failures in sea campaigns, escapes from ports, about friends killed at the bottom of the sea, retreat on land, bombed German cities. Personally, my anxiety about the fate of my parents and sister never left me. When U-953, heading eastward, crept past the Shetland Islands in the second week of October, 1944, the destruction of the German submarine fleet was coming to an end. Since we left besieged La Rochelle, 17 U-boats had been sunk, almost the entire contingent retained for combat operations at sea. 4 of them had embarked on their first combat cruise from Norway. These subs were equipped with schnorkels, manned by well-trained but inexperienced and misinstructed crews. They became easy prey for the Allies. 40 miles northeast of the Shetland Islands, We came within hunting range of a group of British patrol ships, controlling the approaches to the Norwegian Sea. A 28-hour period of brutal destroyer pursuit, nervous tension of the crew, and bursting depth bombs ensued. During this final test, we moved underwater close to the surface, ready at any moment to open fire and die. And yet, U-953 again managed to slip out of the devil's embrace. For many hours afterward, explosions continued to sound astern of our boat until, after 6 weeks of unprecedented underwater travel, the sky-high mountain ranges of Norway stopped our eastward movement. About 2 hours after dawn, I spotted through my periscope a formation of airplanes patrolling in the sky and a low beacon on a lone rock in the middle of the passage into the fjord. The sea waves were pouncing on the tiny bare rocky island, foaming the sea surface around it. Not trusting the schnorkel any longer, I switched on the electric motors. The U-953, struggling to overcome the current, was coming to a position from which it was possible to enter the fjord. The sea waves crashed against the boat. There was a heavy thump, then a rumble and a clang. The schnorkel pipe had fallen to the deck. The tide threatened to smash the boat against the rocks. U-953 made a dash forward at 10 knots, all she could squeeze out of herself in her underwater position. She thrashed like a salmon in rough waters, slowly advancing meter by meter. After passing the lighthouse, U-953 cut into a rough whirlpool and raced to the rock, steeply rising above the sea. A quick change of rudders, and the boat entered the fjord, and so we survived again. A Coast Guard minesweeper stood motionless in the center of the fjord, oblivious to our arrival. I could clearly make out the faces of the sailors on the minesweeper in the periscope eyepieces, then lowered the periscope to catch them off guard. The surfacing command ended our long stay underwater. Compressed air hissed in the lines. With a muffled groan, the boat surfaced into daylight under the mouth of the minesweeper's guns. The anxious captain shouted through a megaphone, "Where the hell did you come from?" Satisfied with the success of my little ruse, I replied, "We are an inspection. Do you have any contraband on board?" "No contraband. We have a harem, but not for your boys." And, as if fearing our inspection, the captain ordered the helmsman to reverse course. Meanwhile, my boat's crew poured out through the hatch. Some were busy with the guns, others were hauling ammunition, and still others were leaning over the bridge rail with pale faces and cigarettes in their mouths. After breathing the fresh sea air for a while, I was almost suffocated by the stench coming from the hatchway. The scent of cigarettes, for which I had longed, could not overpower the horrible odor of 6 days of rotting in the hull. On the contrary, the first cigarette smelled bitter. But 2 hours later, as the U-953 turned into the Bergen Fjord, I fully enjoyed it. The trawler warned of the boat's arrival, contributing to the organization of a very modest reception in our honor. A small group of people dressed in blue Navy uniforms or gray leather clothing came out to the dock to greet us. They had the rare opportunity to witness the return of a submarine from a cruise. For many months, the boats had gone to sea irretrievably. My crew, however, hardly looked like returning heroes. With unwashed hair, long beards, green faces, and sunken cheeks, eyeballs rolling out like billiard balls, we looked more like emaciated and tired forest gorillas. The ends from the submarine were secured to the pier. The senior officer who came aboard accepted my terse report with a nod and greeted the crew. He informed us that severe trials lay ahead, but also assured us, with a note of warmth in his voice, that the worst was over and the situation would improve dramatically in the near future. Then the senior officer invited us for cocktails and dinner. Strong drinks and hearty food were served at the table. We were asked about the last days in Brest and the situation in La Rochelle. My submariners responded by telling fantastic stories in the spirit of 1001 Nights. When it was discovered that they had taken too much liquor, I rose from the table. Ending the feast, Nar was put into a separate room, and soon the bearded sea wolves could be heard singing songs loudly as they soaked in the baths or stood under the showers. The next day, after a good night's sleep, I was determined to get a new submarine as U-953 was falling apart before my eyes. She needed not only a new schmirkel, but also the replacement of 2 diesels, the entire set of batteries, and 1,000 other pieces of miscellaneous equipment. About this, I had a word with the chief engineer of the flotilla. It turned out that the Navy base did not have any of the parts I needed, and there was absolutely no way to put my boat in dry dock for a lengthy overhaul. I think I convinced the chief engineer that I should be provided with a new boat. But Bergen lacked anything more substantial than spare parts and facilities for repairs. No mail was delivered there. I counted on a letter, a telegram, anything, just to know that everything was all right at home. And our sacks of letters must have been lost somewhere, either in the confusion of the retreat from France, or because the mail ships were sunk by enemy aircraft in the Skagerrak Strait or in the fjords. We were cut off from our homeland. The absence of news about the fate of our relatives and friends was hard on each of us. Under low, gray, layered clouds, I took the U-953 to the arsenal to unload torpedoes. There were several battered boat hulls to be cut for scrap. I expected a revival of activity by our submarines based in Norway after the ports in France had been lost. But there was a depressing silence. In vain I had hoped for the long-promised new types of subs. Dinner in the accommodation block was sparse and strictly rationed, which was to be expected under the prevailing conditions in the 5th year of the war. I was informed that the commandant of the city had decided to organize a gala evening in our honor, where we could indulge in various drinks, snacks, listen to music and dance with Norwegian girls. Once back in my room, I pulled out of my only suitcase the set of Navy uniforms I had brought with me. It was damp, wrinkled, and moldy. The foul odor accompanied me as I drove to the country house in the mountains at the flotilla resort. On the morning of my 3rd day ashore, I met an old acquaintance of mine, Captain Rosing, an officer of Headquarters Group West. He had managed to get out by airplane from La Rochelle a few hours before the Americans entered. His arrival in Norway was followed by the opening of a headquarters facility near the submarine housing complex to intensify submarine warfare against the British. After briefly informing Rosing about my last trip, I asked him, "Herr Captain, please assist me in obtaining a new boat, if possible, of the latest type. U-953 is simply unsuitable for going to sea. In addition, there are no conditions in Norway to repair it and make it combat ready. I don't see how we can fulfill your request." Rosing replied, "We are now making every effort to restore every boat of the usual type for the upcoming major battles in the spring. Herr Captain, it will take as long to repair our boat as it will to build a new one. That's not for you to decide. Your business is to follow orders." It was clear to him there was no point in talking anymore. I was sent on leave. The same day I had the idea of repairing my boat at the shipyards in Germany. My future was closely connected with U-953. I realized that it was better to give up my dreams of a new boat and concentrate on extending the life of the old one. The crew accepted this idea stoically. Of much greater concern was the news broadcast over the radio. We learned that the British had reached the Lower Rhine and the Americans had occupied the first German city of Aachen. It was reported about the massive Allied bombing of Stuttgart, Munich, and even Innsbruck. The situation was as bad as possible, although we were assured that not all was lost. The voice from Berlin again and again insinuated to us that a new weapon would soon be used which would ensure our final victory. We saw that we were trusted, and we went to sea with the purpose of justifying this trust. At dusk on a foggy day in late October, U-953 was ready to leave port. Before nightfall, a Coast Guard cutter took us out into the fjord. It was a silent passage through enemy waters where British torpedo boats were already operating. At the end of the first night, we arrived at Haugesund Bay and sheltered the boat under the pier overhang for the day. The next night followed the escort among rocks, rapids and crampons along the rocky coast to Stafenrap. Again, we spent the day idling at the unprotected pier in nervous tension. At sunset, we began the all-night crossing through fjords and dangerous crampons to Egersund. Here we fastened our moorings to stunted pine trees growing out of the crevices of the rock stone, and hid under their branches. The next night we went unescorted into the open sea, and using the schnorkel temporarily repaired in Bergen, rounded the southern heel of Norway and entered Skagerrak Strait. 2 nights later we met a German convoy in the Baltic Sea, and with the coming of day passed the lighthouse of Kiel Bay. On a gray, cold morning, U-953 moored at the Tirpitz Pier. We returned to Germany. Our arrival was not solemnized. In fact, it went unnoticed. Dressed in my old wrinkled leather suit, I walked out onto the pier dot and headed for the pre-flood steamer that had been at the pier since the beginning of the war. I looked there for the residence of the 5th Flotilla Command, as the familiar tender Lech had already disappeared. I was informed that the residents had moved ashore. Walking along the familiar tarred planks of the decking, I observed ample evidence of the port's degradation since my last visit 22 months ago. An old tender lay bombed ashore, its decks awash with oil slick and murky water. Black walls of ruins loomed in the distance. Mountains of scrap metal and construction debris filled the space that had once been the fashionable neighborhood of Beeloo. I struggled to find the new Flotilla Command residence among the ruined barracks. The commander listened to my report with complete indifference. I was ordered to go to Lübeck. There we could confidently count on the repair of the submarine. Here, in Kiel, could not be guaranteed even its safety. An hour after we had secured the moorings, they had to be removed again. U-953 left Kiel Bay and hurried eastward under the darkening evening sky. As the morning fog cleared, the boat entered the mouth of the Trave River and shortly after noon docked at the rickety pier of the small naval base, Lübeck Seam. I did not catch the commandant of the base at his residence. The sentry reported that he had gone to breakfast and might not return until a few hours later. The base's small apartment complex was deserted. It didn't seem to be used much. U-953 was the only submarine moored to the pier. My submariners ate breakfast sitting on the bridge railing or right on the deck. Breakfast turned out to be meager, but for that we were thankful. At noon I was informed that the commandant was ready to meet us. We assembled on a small platform, and I introduced the crew to a rather well-fed officer. He said something to me to the effect that he had chosen this place to serve the fatherland in harmony with his habits and family duties. I noticed with indignation the displeased look on his face as he inspected my submariners, unkempt and emaciated after a long campaign. We immediately began to regain our strength. I took U-953 to the dry dock, where she was to be refitted. Returning to the accommodation complex, I was pleased to find that the XO had taken care of settling the crew into barracks. My suitcase was taken to the corner room that was to be my home for a while. I unpacked, sent some of my clothes to be washed and cleaned. Then, not without excitement, I tried to contact my relatives. However, the telephone connection to Darmstadt was inactive, and this was 2 months after the air raid. I sent a telegram to my relatives asking for an immediate reply. It soon became clear that the recovery of U-953 would take 8 to 10 weeks. This news, which meant an extended vacation for the entire crew, was taken as a great favor by the submariners, whose eagerness to be at home, to find their relatives and friends had been growing ever since we arrived in Norway. Since my parents did not reply to my urgent telegram, I decided to leave home as early as possible. Having already packed for the road, I received a message from the headquarters that my chief and XO were being taken away from me. It was with great regret that I parted with the chief engineer, an experienced and outstanding engineer, and I was even more disappointed when in his place they sent me an inert chief engineer from U-415. To make matters worse, my boat was assigned to a young cadet who had no idea about submarines at all. Since it was envisioned that he would take the place of XO, I urgently promoted my submariner Zimmer, although he also lacked experience. Such a dangerous shake-up of the boat's command staff required decisive action, but I decided to do nothing until my return. On a cold, foggy day in early November, I set out from Lübeck to Darmstadt via Berlin. The train was packed with passengers with a strong Baltic accent. They were refugees fleeing the advancing Russian troops. They were mostly women, children, and old men, dressed in old, shabby clothes and dragging their miserable belongings with them. Shivering from the cold, they stood by their boxes, knots, and valises. From compartment to compartment, alarming news and rumors were spreading. The Eastern Front was rapidly moving westward, and a deadly danger was looming over Königsberg. And almost as fast, the Western Front was moving eastward. Standing in the aisle of the carriage and immersed in unhappy reflections, I looked out of the window. At my feet was a suitcase with presents for my parents and Trudy. Outside the window was a bleak gray landscape. As time went on, the monotonous North German plains became more and more ruins with blackened walls, craters, piles of rubble, and dilapidated chimneys. Then came the ruins of destroyed city neighborhoods. We had arrived in Berlin. Everywhere people were fleeing from somewhere. The train station was packed with thousands of passengers. Women dressed in Red Cross uniforms were handing out food and some black stuff they called coffee. Skinny young infantrymen with heavy loads of rifles and duffel bags in shabby patched uniforms dragged through the station like old men. I squeezed my luggage through the dense crowd of people on the platform and headed for the Angalta station. The subway ride had relieved me of my worries about the extensive destruction in the city, but even underground I could see the ruined fates of people. The subway was inhabited by thousands of homeless people, exhausted women and children, confused soldiers hurrying to their ruined homes or to the crumbling front. Their faces were stamped with want, hunger, sleeplessness, indifference, and detachment. Night came when the darkened train left the ruined Berlin behind, and to a shrill horn rattled southward. On the train I killed time as best I could, smoking, thinking, and dreaming. According to my calculations, I should have been home, if not in Darmstadt, then in my father's factory. At noon the next day, provided that there were no surprises. 1 o'clock in the morning. The seat in the compartment opposite was taken by a girl in a Luftwaffe uniform and began to take more than a superficial interest in me. To get rid of her obsessive curiosity, I went out into the corridor and lit a cigarette. A few seconds later, however, the girl followed me. "Aren't you Trudy's brother?" she asked in an uncertain voice. Reluctantly, I answered, "No, girl, you must be mistaken." "I'm sorry," she apologized, "but you look just like him. You see, she's my friend. Her brother is in the Navy. The resemblance is striking." After that, I gave up. "Okay, I'll admit it. I'm Trudy's brother. Who are you?" She smiled. Her memory was good. "Don't you recognize me? I'm Clara Hinger, Trudy's classmate, maybe her closest friend." No, I didn't recognize the girl. She was just a little girl then, and I was already a young man of 15. 10 years had passed since then, a lifetime. Now that she was with me, I was glad to be able to pass the time with pleasant memories of my happy youth. We talked about our school years and discussed long-forgotten episodes. She was indeed my sister's closest friend when we lived near Lake Constanza. Clara said she had always liked my parents, and the big article about them in the local paper was beautifully written. Suddenly, spasms squeezed my throat. "What article are you talking about?" Her eyes widened, and her mouth twisted in horror. "You don't know?" she marveled. "No, of course you don't know." Clara covered her face with her hands. There was nothing more she wanted to tell me. Everything spun around, slowly at first, then faster. It was as if a big wheel was spinning with inertia. I heard the girl continue to talk through her tears. "Oh, forgive me. Trudy and your parents were killed in an air raid on Darmstadt 2 months ago." Feeling dizzy, I leaned against the compartment wall to get up and straighten myself. The window, the wall, the people swam before my eyes. I clenched my teeth and held back the tears. No one should see me cry. I covered my eyes and took a deep, long breath. Gradually, I don't know how long it took, I came to my senses and began to take in what I'd heard. Could Clara have been wrong? But no, I realized that she had told the truth. It's all over now. I would never see my loved ones, never hear my little sister laugh, never feel my mother's care, never hear my father talk about his projects. By some terrible mistake, they left this world, not me. I was the one who was supposed to die. And 1,000 times I was ready for it. I went to fight at sea to save their lives, to keep them safe. But I was wrong in my expectations. Why did the Almighty choose to take their innocent lives over my sinful one? Clara gradually recovered from the shock. She was mortified that she was the messenger of death. I tried to reassure her. I told her that she had spared me the burden of not knowing the fate of my parents and the aimless trip. I changed my plans. There was no point in going to Darmstadt. At Eisenach, Clara and I transferred to another train and traveled to the town of Lake Constanza. During the interminably long night, our conversation did not flow. I could think of nothing but the loss of my family and the worthlessness of everything else. As the train rushed along the tracks in the gray November morning, I wiped the window glass and saw a slogan on the wall of the station building that looked like a wicked irony. Our cities are dying, our walls are crumbling, but our hearts will never waver. As night darkness enveloped the eastern spurs of the Black Forest, the train arrived in Clara's hometown. She bade me farewell, embarrassed and discouraged. I drove on in the night darkness and did not leave the train until I saw the moonlight reflecting on the surface of Lake Constance. I took my luggage out of the wagon at East Uberlingen, where my relatives were fleeing the war. As I began to search for their home, I felt a sudden urge to return to the train station, take another train, and return to the submarine to my crew. I belonged to them. But I continued my search for my relatives, holding a heavy suitcase of gifts in my hand. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't even have a favorite girl I could give them to. Marian had died in the ruins of Berlin. Yvonne had disappeared even earlier. I lost Marguerite in Paris, occupied by the Americans. Marika was married to someone else. My appearance on the doorstep of my grandfather's house caused confusion. The numerous relatives, who lived more or less harmoniously under a common roof, had evidently not expected my return from the Atlantic. They assumed that I had been lost in the chaos that followed the Allied invasion of the continent, and around the time my parents received their last letter from me. Their surprise at my rebirth from oblivion was quickly replaced by worried looks and anxious whispers behind my back. To reassure my relatives, I said firmly, "Your anxiety is understandable to me. No need to make excuses. What do you intend to do?" "I don't know. Do you want to stay with us?" "No, I just came to see you. I'll leave my books and some things with you." I soon learned that my cousin Laura had set up somewhere in the Black Forest. I immediately called her and found out that there was a lot of snow and perfect conditions for skiing. I finally found a refuge, a place to forget myself for a while. Early the next morning, I left my books and gifts with my relatives and left the lake. A slow-moving train took me to the mountains, which changed from dark green to dazzling white within an hour. Winter had come sooner than expected. Deep in the woods at a small station, I boarded a sleigh, and the horses took me to the highlands of Schönwald. There a cousin reserved a room for me at a hotel. Laura was a passionate fan of skiing. For the next few days, we would meet her as soon as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the snow-white tops of the huge conifers, climb up and ski down into the valley. Each morning we would repeat these ascents and descents several times, eat breakfast with the contents of the canvas bag tied to my belt, then ski across the snow-white fields, through the frozen mountain streams until sunset. Gradually my depression loosened its grip. Laura tried to cheer me up, but she succeeded only to a degree. Every evening we heard the echo of artillery cannonade coming from the Vosges, only 60 kilometers to the west. We could not help but hear radio broadcasts reporting our staggering losses on all fronts. The Soviets had captured Riga, Lithuania, half of Poland, and had established a bridgehead for an offensive in the Balkans. There was fierce fighting on the west bank of the Rhine, and the Americans had razed Cologne and Aachen to the ground. I listened to these reports with growing anxiety. No, I could no longer lead an idle life as our defenses on the Rhine crumbled and German cities disappeared in flames and billows of smoke. I was tightly bound to my boat and crew. It was all I had left. One cold day in November, I said goodbye to Laura and boarded a sled headed for the station. As we descended into the silent valley, I asked myself, my God, what will happen to Germany? Where has this miracle weapon, which we have been promised so many times, gone? How would we be able to stop the Russians, the Americans, the British, the French, the whole world, without it? I arrived at the Lübeck-Seam submarine base on a cold, rainy day. Young XO Zeld, whom I left in charge of a small part of the submarine crew for the duration of my absence, reported that air raids and shortages of spare parts had slowed the repair of the U-953. He was clearly behind schedule, and we would have been lucky if the sub had put to sea on New Year's Day. However, in spite of the unpleasant news, I settled down in my room feeling as if I had found salvation from all troubles. It smelled of resinous pine needles. Through the thin walls I could hear my submariners talking in the neighboring rooms, recognized the voices of each of them. Their presence made me happy. It gave confidence and meaning to existence. I spent the evening with my submariners and learned that many of them had also experienced their own personal tragedies while on leave. Berger found his hometown of Cleve, located very close to the front lines to the west, in ruins. His wife and only child had perished in a fire. Someone showed him their burial place. Immediately after visiting the grave, he returned to the base to his submarine. One of the motormen also found only the ruins of his house. His parents had gone missing. Upon learning of this, he too hurried back to base. Other submariners spent their vacations on trains and buses trying to find their families fleeing from town to town. Those who did meet their families had little time to communicate with them. Some never made it home at all. Their towns were already behind the front line, in Silesia. For all of them, as well as for me, there was only one road left: to return to the submarine to their comrades with whom they could share their tragic fate. However, my relationship with all the crew members was not cloudless. December came with its frost and snow, with penetrating eastern winds. The long winter had begun. My mood was in line with the inclement days, marred by the presence of 3 officers in the crew. The XO, the chief engineer, and the cadet were neither experienced nor mature. They gave me more trouble than help and frustrated the crew. My submariners, professionals with a long record of service, combat experience, and awards, saw little use for the immature chief engineer and treated the young cadet with undisguised contempt. To put up with this state of affairs on a combat submarine was difficult and dangerous. I asked the personnel department to replace the chief engineer and the cadet. Such a duty request, which a year ago would have been granted automatically, even if it would have been regarded as a caprice of the captain, this time was firmly rejected. My attempt to prove that a personnel replacement was necessary to preserve the boat's and crew's fighting ability caused only a dismissive wave. It was as if I was given to understand. What difference does it make? The life of a submarine is too short to worry about, even if the submarine crew is perfect. It wasn't just incompetence that was the cause of my dissatisfaction with the cadet. Worse still, he had been assigned by the Nazi Party to hammer official dogmas, ideals, and slogans into the submariners' heads. Party interference in the affairs of the submarine fleet had a short but turbulent history, which was preceded by a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler. Prior to that, our Navy was free from political interference. Even after the assassination attempt, when the party influence on all aspects of national life sharply increased, submarine commanders, including myself, successfully countered the infiltration of political officers into the submariners by passive resistance. But as the Reich declined, party influence became more and more powerful and dogmatic. This drove veterans, officers and enlisted personnel who shared their sentiments to despair. Submariners occasionally complained to me about a cadet's attempts to instruct them in party spirit. Their reaction to this was quite natural. They had proved their loyalty to duty and heroism by deeds and actions, and did not need party teachings on how to fight and die. Whether or not I could get rid of the cadet, I was determined to put an end to his annoying lectures. At a general crew meeting, I pointed out to the chief engineer, the XO, and the cadet that they had not yet acquired sufficient qualifications to fulfill their positions aboard the submarine. I warned them that they would not be able to remain long at their posts unless they strictly followed my orders concerning their preparations for a combat tour. Besides, I had so loaded the cadets with minor errands that they had no time left to make party speeches. In the second week of December, activity in the harbor dramatically increased, which indicated the preparation of our spring offensive at sea. Within 10 days, 5 conventional submarines arrived from the Baltic. Empty barracks were filled, repair work in the dry dock intensified. But the ships that arrived in port did not bring anything new to our combat potential. They were no different from our old U-953. In short, military preparations did not promise to stop our catastrophic fall into the abyss. And then there was a glimmer of hope on the Western Front. In the early morning of December 16, our armies launched a powerful counteroffensive in the Ardennes against Anglo-American forces. German radio stations reported major successes of the German troops, which in the first few hours advanced far into the depths of enemy territory. Finally began the long-promised major offensive. We moved westward again, and our divisions will not stop until the last Allied soldier is thrown into the sea. I listened to the victorious news with mixed feelings of hope, anxiety, and restraint. Although the breakthrough in the Ardennes had produced initial impressive results, it had occurred on a narrow enough front for our troops to penetrate deep into the south. My hopes faded and anxiety grew as the days passed, and news of our successes no longer came. A week after we had been roused by fanfare and military marches, the voices assuring us of imminent victory fell silent. The advance was slowed by cold and mud, and then halted by fresh Allied divisions thrown in to eliminate our offensive wedge. On Christmas Eve, our chances of a major victory came to zero. On Christmas Eve, the harbor was solemn and quiet, at least until midnight. I made my evening rounds of the rooms, chatting with my submariners, handing out assurances they didn't need. Each of them had covered their souls with a sturdy shell to protect themselves from the vicissitudes of a decaying world. I returned to my room after drinking a fair amount of liquor with my officers, non-commissioned officers, and sailors. I made myself some coffee on a hot stove, sank into a chair, and began to read. The room was saturated with the odor of pine needles from the Christmas tree, which the sailors had set up in one corner. It reminded me of happy Christmas celebrations in the past. The apartment complex was quieting down. I gradually fell asleep, dreaming of a merry feast. A few hours after midnight, I was awakened by a loud knock on the door. It was my idea cadet who was on watch. Herr Oberleutnant, I saw one of the sailors lead a woman through a passage in the fence and hide with her in a room. The report interested me. I went to the far end of the corridor where the sailor's room was. Trying not to make any noise, I opened the door. The room was dark and quiet. I turned on the light, but found that the boys had taken care of it by unscrewing the bulbs. "Go and get a flashlight, cadet." "Yes, Herr Oberleutnant," he exclaimed, burning with impatience. I stayed at the door, listening. I heard only the quiet, measured breathing of the sleeping sailors. It was a pity that the cadet had interfered and prevented me from sleeping. At this stage of the war, did it matter where our boys made love? After all, each of us has not so much to live and love, and yet discipline must be observed. The cadet returned with a flashlight, and I directed the beam of light at the first sleeping sailor. Everything in his bed looked natural. The next sailor woke up to the light and blinked his eyelashes. The third bed was suspiciously voluminous. I lifted the edge of the blanket, and the frightened face of a young blonde girl was revealed underneath. I realized how tactless I had acted and lowered the edge of the blanket, feeling guilty. Then a general light came on in the barracks, and I discovered 2 more girls. I confined my inspection to this room, expecting that the occupants of the others, hearing the commotion, would try to get rid of their partners as quickly as possible. As for the 3 caught sailors, I had to solve the old conflict between the requirements of discipline and my personal sympathy for the boys. I deferred my decision until after the holidays. On the 2nd day after Christmas, the ground shook and a muffled murmur was heard in the distance. It was very familiar to me. There was a massive bombardment of a city, in this case Hamburg. I took my high magnification binoculars and took a position on the highway nearby, on the hill that dominated the terrain. There was not a cloud in the blue sky. The air was cold and clear. Hamburg was illuminated by the white winter sun. From my seat I could see the glare of the sun on the wings and fuselages of the flying fortresses that came from the sea. They smoothly descended from the sky and dive on the city. Plane after plane floated out of the distant haze. In the gaps between hundreds of bombers and countless fighter escorts bounced gray and black lumps from the bursts of anti-aircraft shells. I saw through the eyepieces of binoculars how bombs were falling on Hamburg, how red and yellow balls flashed against the blue silk of the sky, how burning airplanes exploded and tumbled in the air, how our Messerschmitts, like hawks, threw themselves at the bombers, filling the airspace with the wreckage of enemy flying machines. Beneath my feet, at a distance of many kilometers from the battle, the ground trembled. Thousands of innocent citizens of Hamburg who had prayed for Christmas were burned alive and reduced to ashes. My relatives must have perished in the same way. What a vile, ridiculous war in which healthy men and the most advanced machinery are used to destroy helpless and harmless people. I persuaded myself that I was engaged in another war, where some sink other ships with arms and ammunition before the latter were used for murder and destruction. But whichever way the war is fought, its horrific consequences are beyond imagination. Death on a gigantic scale became so mundane that life itself seemed irrelevant, superfluous, and the ordinary pleasures of life, something abnormal, strange, and ridiculous. Even the love of a decent woman was perceived as a hindrance to the daily nightmare of survival. My bitterness at the tragic course of the war, at the stupidity and incompetence of the headquarters, which doomed us to senseless sacrifices, became unbearable in early January. After trying to expedite repairs to our boat between Christmas and New Year's Day, I was summoned, without any explanation, to Admiral Dönitz at the residence of his headquarters, located in the vicinity of Berlin. This was strange, as Leo had become more and more distant from his captains. During the years of triumph and victories, he regularly visited submarine commanders and their crews in ports. Later he discontinued his visits and instead summoned commanders to meetings in the execrable atmosphere of headquarters in Paris. After the Allied capture of Paris and the loss of most of our ships, Lev stopped inviting captains. In Berlin, I took a room at the Hotel Fürstendorf, showered and shaved, put on a fresh white shirt and a new tie. Then I took a waiting minibus to the highway to the eastern suburbs of the capital Brno. Driving along a deserted highway through a pine grove, I arrived at a complex of headquarters buildings, carefully guarded and exotically named Coral. After an ID check by a sentry, I was escorted inside the mighty naval department. A maze of corridors clean to a shine, a legion of officers in immaculate white uniforms made the building look like a hospital. Only the smells of ether and antiseptic were absent. I immediately felt out of place. I was drawn back to my sweaty, grimy crew. I was informed that the admiral had not yet arrived and was invited to breakfast. In the dining room, the decorated tables, fine tablecloths, select china, ornate silverware, and rows of waiters in white tails gave me the impression of some unnecessary parade. I thought that most of these people could have been put to better use during the war years. If they had entertained themselves less and endeavored to supply us with the means of fighting battles, Germany would have retained many of those 203 U-boat crews that had been sunk the previous year. Perhaps we would then have had the submarine armada of 682 operational units that has been sent to the bottom since the war began. When the elegant staffers left the mess hall, I was left with 5 officers whose blue uniforms contrasted sharply with the whiteness of the uniforms of the permanent occupants of this building. Their lack of decorations characterized them as newcomers who had not yet smelled gunpowder. From our conversation, I learned that they were commanders of a new batch of submarines, which by the time of staffing had already become obsolete. These guys were ready to go to sea, but they were delayed by a call from the admiral. Looking at them, I saw dead men in front of me. In the absence of combat experience, they had no chance of survival, even if they were not lacking in intelligence, ability, and good training. In the face of the enemy's vast and varied anti-submarine defense system, they would inevitably be lost. I suspected that they had not even been briefed as to what awaited them. After a while, we were informed that the admiral was ready to receive us and were led into a large, bright office. Dennett stood at the window, the rays of the winter sun playing on his pale face. He had aged considerably since I had last seen him in Lorient in 1941. He had pinned the Iron Cross to my chest on a warm fall day. Now he looked gaunt, stunted, and less agile. The admiral shook hands with each of us and invited us to sit down in the chairs opposite his desk. He strode in front of us and began to speak, trying to be confident and decisive. He spoke of the need for self-sacrifice and of the great change for the better in submarine warfare that was about to take place. The purpose of our forthcoming campaign, he said, was to tie up Allied naval forces in their own waters and to prevent enemy operations close to the coasts of territories controlled by our forces. We were to be those valiant warriors who would fight selflessly until new types of boats changed the course of the war in our favor. When we returned from the campaign, we would get the first of these boats. Dennett concluded by striking us with the statement that in order to fulfill the tasks facing Germany, he would send to the front all available boats, even those for training purposes. The admiral's speech was short but impressive. Dennett still had not lost his ability to ignite sparks of enthusiasm in us, just as after his speeches in the years of triumph. He said nothing new, however, and seemed to me to be convincing only because we desperately wanted to believe him. My view of Dennett was that his tactics, which had once secured our victories, were now causing the senseless deaths of thousands of submariners along with their obsolete submarines. His last order could only be seen as a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable defeat, and yet I wished with all my heart that I had been wrong. After a 2-day absence, I returned to the base. The next morning at breakfast, the XO reported that the repairs to the U-953 had been completed and the boat had been towed to the pier the day before. Then, in great excitement, he informed me that 2 boats of the newest type had arrived in port and were moored alongside ours before dusk. I broke off breakfast, changed into my leather suit, and went down to the pier. At its foot stood the U-953, freshly painted, her deck scrubbed, her guns with grease still on them. My submariners gathered on the aft deck for roll call. Each of them had one eye on me and the other on the monstrous new subs that stood on either side of ours. I stepped aboard our reborn workhorse, answered the XO's report and the crew's cheers, then told everyone that we would have to make one more trip in our old sub before we would be given a new type of boat like the ones rocking alongside us. I promised this in the hope that Dennett would keep his promise. From what a cursory inspection of the U-953 gave me, I concluded that the mechanics had done a thorough job in the dry dock. Suffering from all sorts of senile diseases, she had been re-equipped with new equipment. The old primitive schmirkel, which had caused us so much trouble, had been replaced by a new hydraulic device with an improved float. The stench of decay and stagnation was replaced by the smell of new paint. U-953 seemed to be ready to go. I then decided to familiarize myself with one of the underwater curiosities. Crossing the gangway to one of the steel whales, I asked the watchman if the commander was in place. He answered in the affirmative. "What's his name?" Lieutenant Commander Siegmann, my old captain from U-230. I climbed up the immense shell of the light hull to the bridge, descended through the hatch into the combat deck, equipped with the most sophisticated equipment, and from it into the central station room, which looked like a power station. Noticing Siegmann standing with his back to me, I said excitedly, "Good morning. I would like to report my arrival." Siegmann turned around. "What the hell? Is that you? What brings you to this lousy port?" "I came from Norway on an old wreck to make a new one." "Do you still sail on one of those old coffins?" he asked with surprise. "Alas, I don't have your connections." "Congratulations on your new submarine." "Thank you. Come on, I'll show her to you." "Or have you seen such a ship before?" "No, I haven't had the pleasure." As we walked to the forward bays, Siegmann said he had replaced the U-230 with a new sub last spring. On August 21, when the Allies landed at Toulon, the crew escaped from the U-230, which was already commanded by Eberbach. Most of our old comrades were captured. I also learned from Siegmann that Friedrich left the U-230 with him and remains its chief engineer. Riedel, on the other hand, became captain of the U-242. We finally reached the forward torpedo bay. In its vast room, 6 torpedo tubes were installed instead of the 4 available on conventional submarines. Along the solid hull wall was a storage area for 14 unloaded torpedoes. "We load the tubes hydraulically in 10 minutes, Siegmann explained. "We just push the buttons and everything goes by itself." We never touched the torpedoes again. The compartment was equipped with mechanisms for storing, moving, and loading torpedoes into the apparatus. Torpedoists, who slept on old boats in a huddle among steelfish, had a spacious room to rest here. Officers and non-commissioned officers occupied rooms similar to first-class cabins on a passenger liner. The new boat had almost 3 times the displacement of the U-953. "You won't believe this, but we move faster underwater than we do on the surface," Siegmann continued to explain. "We can move there at a top speed of 17 knots for quite a long time. And besides, you can attack the convoy from an underwater position." That's not all. Not only do we move faster underwater, but we are also capable of firing torpedoes from a depth of 50 meters without seeing the target. Our diving depth is twice as deep as yours, and we can easily evade a pursuing escort. So you're virtually invulnerable. Exactly. Our high speed allows us to attack and escape undetected. The new electronic fire control system gives us 100% accuracy. Our new Schnurkel acts like your periscope. It retracts very quickly and allows you to recharge your battery sooner. Our submarine is the ideal submarine. What we had been told for many months was true. The new submarines did exist, and the general consensus was that they were in fact miracle submarines. Sent to sea in sufficient numbers, they could drive the Allies into a blind defense at sea. If only the enemy offensive from the east and west could be delayed for a certain time. Siegmann declined my offer of breakfast. He was in a hurry to spend the end of the week with his family. We parted warmly, wishing each other good luck and success. Both were aware of what now separated us. His splendid new boat gave him a strong guarantee of surviving the end of the war. My ancient one condemned me to certain doom. With bitterness in my soul and anxiety for my crew, I prepared to go to sea. On the morning of February 8, U-953 slipped out of the Bay of Lübeck and headed north. After 12 hours of floundering in the waves, it seemed to us that we had never been on land. The boat, contrary to the previous sarcastic remarks against it, demonstrated high performance and smooth operation of mechanisms. At high speed, U-953 passed through cramped and shallow waters among the Danish islands. New electronic equipment protected her from surprise attack of the enemy. A new sensitive radar, compact and easily operated, was constantly rotating, monitoring the situation in the sky and at sea. Before the second day of the campaign, our boat entered Skagerrak Strait. Her entry into deep water coincided with the appearance of fog and increased enemy activity. Radar detected weak pulses from various sources, but the boat was protected by a dense shroud of fog, like a fragile glass vessel placed in a box of absorbent cotton. I had no intention of risking the crew and the boat just for the sake of increasing the speed of travel in a surface position. As soon as the radar detected 2 airplanes, I ordered them to go underwater. The hiss of air escaping from the tanks was heard, and I felt the boat begin to submerge. Before closing the hatch cover, I thought that it would be difficult for the British to find our dive site in the fog. U-953 went under. I figured that our movement at depth would last until the end of the crossing, 7 or 8 weeks. The hiss of trapped air was followed by a cry of alarm. A crack in the diesel loading hatch. The boat is taking on water. Not again, I wailed. Damn this old boat. Close the valves. Prepare for surfacing. Level off, chief engineer. Suddenly, the boat gave a sharp trim to the stern. Deciding that the leak is serious, I ordered to turn on both bottom pumps. But before they worked, U-953 began to sink rapidly. Trying to be as calm as possible, I gave orders. Blow ballast. Both engines full speed. Surface. Put on life preservers. In response to the chief engineer's exclamation, "Bridge clear," I rushed to the deckhouse hatch. The anti-aircraft gunners followed me. Above, the day changed to twilight. The density of the fog was so great that the bow and stern of the boat disappeared from sight. We had only one option left, to move north into the Oslo fjord. There, at the Navy base at Horten, I expected to repair the leak. If we survived the night, of course. Plane, bearing 1225, distance 5,000 meters, sounded an excited voice in the intercom. Then the airplane engines roared. A 20mm twin anti-aircraft gun began to strike from the starboard side, followed by a 37mm automatic cannon. A moment later, a faint shadow swept over the boat and disappeared into the distance before the anti-aircraft gunners could turn their guns. Somewhere nearby, 2 depth bomb explosions sounded almost simultaneously. We heard the noise of the engines of the second approaching airplane. Our artillery sent a curtain of fire into the fog, but the plane was already above us. A bright light spilled from the sky. The fog glowed like a spume of flame. Townies dropped a flare on a parachute, which hovered away from us in the fog. A new attack began from aft on the starboard side. A swarm of tracer bullets burst through the glowing shroud of fog. A second missile was fired. While 2 planes circled above us, radar detected the approach of a third. Soon 4 machines were scurrying through the air like hungry vultures. We waited for the next attack, pulling up a new set of ammunition and staring despondently at the cold waves of Skagerrak. Then the planes began to dive on us one after another. But their strafing attacks failed. The fire of our anti-aircraft guns prevented the planes from bombing. When the attacks were over, radar showed only 3 planes in the air. The diesels rumbled in unison with the roar of the aircraft engines. The barrels of the anti-aircraft guns swiveled according to the radar. For more than 2 hours, the attacks were not repeated. Then at 02.20, our radar went out of action. Not tracking the sky, we were defenseless, unable to fire effectively. The death of the boat seemed more real than going into the Oslo fjord. The British kept a vigilant eye on us for another 2 hours. Then the incredible and incomprehensible happened. The planes, one by one, ceased their pursuit. At 04.40, the sky cleared. Shortly after 06.00, the fog cleared and the mountains of Norway appeared. An hour later, we entered Horten Bay. To my great disappointment, I found that the small Navy base was not equipped to repair the diesel loading hatch. I was advised to go to Kristiansund, which had a decent repair facility. However, I found a capable electrician here who replaced a burned-out radar cable. After a hectic day in port, the U-953 set off again for another dangerous crossing. Sneaking along the rocky coast, groping the locator-free passage between the rocks and fishing schooners, we again managed to pass unnoticed by the British, who vigilantly monitored the southern part of the horizon. An hour after dawn, we slipped into Christiansund Bay, and here I learned that I could only repair the leak on the boat at Bergen. I had no choice but to proceed there in a surface position, relying on the negligence of the British pilots. If the enemy had raided with several airplanes, the boat would naturally be unable to defend itself. We left Christiansund an hour after dusk. The sea had calmed down. Rumbling diesels, the boat moved through the waves dangerously close to the rocks, sheltering in the fjords under the shadow of high mountains. We sailed at night, skirting cliffs and traps. During the day we holed up in harbors that had become unreliable havens. At sunrise on February 11, the boat turned into the Bergen Fjord, completing a passage that seemed quite impossible. We traveled the distance from Lübeck to Bergen in a surface position without a scratch. It is certain that we could not repeat such a trip. In Bergen, the headquarters of the 11th Flotilla became alarmed. It was caused in part by the disappearance of the U-1053. Ready for the campaign boat after a deep dive did not come to the surface. Desperate night searches yielded no results. In addition, the radio reported the depressing news that the Soviet army had broken through the Eastern Front and pushed back our troops to the west bank of the Oder. It seemed incredible, but the Russians managed to create a bridgehead for an offensive near Vritzen, just 60 kilometers east of Berlin and 40 kilometers from the residence of the headquarters of Dönitz. Obviously, the truth is stronger than hope and desire. It is completely impartial. I realized that the threat to the very existence of Germany is far greater than we are able to allow. Nevertheless, I acted as if the war would go on forever. With grim determination, I concentrated on repairing the boat I had planned and preparing it for the mission. In the middle of that anxious day, I took the boat to the dry dock where the loading hatch was to be riveted and welded shut. U-953 had all the necessary equipment on board to do without it. I decided that I would not use that hatch again while I was running the boat. I tried to leave the dock early, as I had one last opportunity to get a good night's sleep in a decent bed before going underwater for a few weeks. In the middle of the next day, I took the U-953 out of the dry dock, making sure that the welded seam could withstand the most ferocious depth bomb attacks. To test the submarine's strength once again, I chose the path that proved fatal for U-1053. The sinking of U-953 was watched by the same minesweeper that was present at the tragic sinking of our predecessor. Having brought the submarine into deep water, I took shelter with the crew in the strong hull and ordered the chief engineer to dive slowly and carefully. We tried to hear the slightest creak of a bolt or crack of a welded seam, but not a sound was heard. U-953 passed the test with honor. She proved her strength, behaved impeccably, willingly followed all our commands. Late in the evening of February 17, we finally left Bergen. Soon night fell over the fjord. Huge rocks closed around the boat as if they wanted to swallow us. The wind drove heavy clouds from west to east, which at times covered the moon and helped us to hide from the enemy. 2 hours later, we reached the northern exit of Bergen Fjord, where quaint cliffs flooded with pale light against the foaming sea waves. Radar pulses over the forward compartments, shouted the operator into the intercom. I realized we couldn't stay on the surface for long, but it took time to guide the sub between the rocks and currents. As soon as she left the calm, silvery waters of the fjord into the rough waves of the Norwegian Sea, I called the chief engineer to the hatch. "Listen carefully, Zeld," I addressed him as if to an unintelligent child. "When I declare an alarm, you must lower the boat underwater extremely carefully. No jerks, no excessive roll, and no more than 30 meters, understand?" "Roger that, Commander." "Target on course 25 to 100, 0 bearing," shouted the sailor. That was the end of our movement on the surface of the sea. The bell rang shrilly, and air rushed out of the Badlista tank with a whoosh. Before descending into the gunwale, I noticed that the bow of the boat was sinking under the water too fast, and shouted, "Glavme, don't lower the boat below 35 meters, be careful." Slamming the hatch cover, I felt that the boat was sinking with increasing trim. Damn it. Level the boat, raise the bow. The bow was sinking on underwater rocks that could shatter the hull. A few seconds later, I was thrown out of the deckhouse onto the deck plates by a powerful jolt. Then the boat bucked like a bucking horse and leaped upward. I took over the controls. A few sharp maneuvers with the horizontal rudders, a quick adjustment, and the boat calmed down. Dazed and angry, I turned to the chief engineer again. "Tell me, for God's sake, what are you doing?" "There was a malfunction trimmer, Commander," mumbled Zeld guiltily. "Nonsense. You installed the trimmer only a few hours ago. Maybe it was the powerful frontal wave." "Okay, Zeld, no more surprises. We'll have to train you for diving when we get back to port. If we get back." I grabbed a microphone from the top shelf and commanded, "Listen in the forward torpedo room. Check the torpedo tubes for all covers and assemblies. All outboard valves. Report results immediately." After a few minutes of tense waiting came the answers. The XO reported that everything was in order in the forward compartment. Despite the powerful jolt, we escaped damage. For some time, U-953 went calmly at the set depth on a course to the northwest into the Atlantic. However, soon the chief engineer again demonstrated his inexperience and, worse, incompetence. Unable to keep the boat running at schnorkel depth, he constantly extended the trumpet to the vigilant Tommies and finally dropped it on the deck. Several times the chief engineer closed the schnorkel pipe with a float, which made the whole crew suffer. Because of suffocation, submariners twitched and vomited. At the same time, mind-boggling pirouettes of the boat threw them from side to side. Glavme made our existence unbearable. We had to take over his functions again and again and teach him the basics of operating the schnorkel. We continued our restless movement, although the march itself seemed futile. By this time, the Allies had concentrated their naval forces, previously scattered over a large expanse of ocean, in the vicinity of the British Isles. Large groups of destroyers patrolled near Shetland and the Faroe Islands in order to intercept lone wolves, about the raids of which the British Admiralty in advance informed sympathetic agents sympathetic to them. None of the preparations for our spring offensive at sea remained a secret to the enemy. In the first days of February, 6 of our submarines were sunk, making their first trip. One after another, they fell into the enemy's traps. These boats were too slow and clumsy to compete with the high-class teams of the enemy, hunting from the sea and from the air. The command staff of most of the boats had no combat experience and did not know the techniques of escape from the hunters. Surrounding Britain's seas turned into a kind of pool in which the British exercised in the art of destroying our helpless submarines, and if hundreds of planes, patrol boats, and hunters could not sink all our U-boats, their work was completed by minefields stretching for several hundred miles. This was the situation when U-953 approached the front line of enemy defenses. Submariners, despite weakened eardrums and poor eyesight, did not lose heart and did not lose their sense of humor. When the torment of the boat's movement at the depth of the schnorkel ended and U-953 went on a normal course, the crew relaxed and tuned into an optimistic mood. Some wrote letters, which, as everyone knew, would never be mailed and would never reach the addressee. Others were reading or composing poetry. By chance I found in a stack of reprinted communiques of the Wehrmacht command samples of the submariners' literary creativity. Their sincerity made up for their lack of elegance of style. An elegy about the schnorkel written by Motor Officer Hageman humorously conveyed the terrible ordeal we endured every night, ever since we left Bergen. Many troubles have fallen upon us unfortunates. With fear, trembling, and weeping, we often drag ourselves to the schnorkel. When the vacuum bursts our eardrums, we fall to the deck in agony and tears. Our eyes roll out of their orbits. To see, we have to hold them in our hands. To ease the pain and straighten up, we balance the pressure by clamping our noses. Everyone's scolding, And it never ends. The behavior of the Schnurkel float is inexplicable, but we've only recently fallen under its sway, and doomed to suffer from it every night. For the rest of our lives, we will depend on the eardrums and eyes of our faithful wives. Mechanic Muller, a good-natured fellow, turned to a more cheerful theme in his work. A sailor often wears a tattoo, as an ornament, not a taboo mark. A confession of each of his sins is pockmarked on his long-suffering skin. Among anchors, ropes, and sawfish, among turtles, butterflies, and starfish, reigns beautiful as a pearl, his naked sweetheart. He carries her firmly, gently, and tenderly, on his left hairy arm. On his right hand, a pair of intertwined hands is carved, and the inscription, *Rose, I'm yours with all your money, the names of other ladies of the heart, and even their birthdays. Yeah, a cheating sailor never loses face, his winded hotties easy to erase. Poke a cross in her face and you get another tattoo. Instead of Rosa, it'll be Susie from Timbuktu. After a week of cautious maneuvers to bypass the hunter's cordons, we received an operational order. It came at 100 on February 23, when U-953 was crossing the sea waves ruffled by a gale from the west. Glavna desperately tried to keep the boat at the depth of the Schnurkel, but it went up and down like on a swing, forcing the submariners to cling to pipelines and valves. At the same time, they did not stop performing their duties. In despair, I again took over the mechanic's functions and reprimanded him. "Chief Engineer, how long do I have to teach you to control the boat and keep it on an even keel?" "The storm is getting worse," he replied. "That's why I can't keep the boat steady." "Zeld, don't bullshit me. You see, the boat is steady. Just keep it at a depth of 13 meters. A few minutes after Zeld took his seat, the boat lost stability again. The submariners frantically gulped air with open mouths and slid on the deck plates like ice. In despair, they gaped and silently begged me to spare them from this senseless torture. Then the submarine jerked sharply and exposed her superstructure above the surface, which became a convenient target. The vultures immediately discovered us. "Radar pulses, Volume 3, shouted the operator. Suppressing the urge to open the hatch and send gunners to the bridge, I commanded. "Both diesels, full speed. Open all air valves. Get the crew into the forward compartment, including you, Chief Engineer." The diesels rumbled powerfully. The submarine rocked desperately. For a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity, sleep remained on the surface defenseless, then went underwater slowly and steadily. When there was a trim of 40 degrees on the bow, discouraged submariners began to make their way to their places in the aft compartments, slowly moving and pushing each other. The work of the diesels was taken over by electric motors, Schnurksall, and the periscope were pulled inward, and the boat tore sharply downward. At a depth of 80 meters, I managed to level her. Only then did we realize that there had been no bombardment. After 20 minutes, when U-953 was already going normally westward, I solved the problem with the chief engineer once and for all. It was obvious that Zeld was hopeless, and no one would forgive my decision to give him another opportunity to kill 54 submariners. I demanded that the chief engineer leave the central station, and the rest of the trip was as a guest in the officer's wardroom. I spent the rest of the night at the central station. When the pulses of the Aztec drummed on the hull of the boat, and the propellers of the Sea Hunter searching overhead rumbled, I ordered to shut down the engines, lower the Schnurkel, and prepare for bombardment. On the table lay a radiogram from headquarters, received shortly after midnight. No one had touched it since. I held the sheet of text up to the small lamp and read, U-953. Conduct operations in Plymouth Bay, beginning at Cape Lizard. Proceed along a 200-meter line from the coast. Information on new minefields will be relayed at a later date. The order surprised me for two reasons. Last October, HQ had stopped submarine operations in the English Channel because our losses there far outnumbered our successes. Why did they decide to send us again to an area that had become a graveyard of German U-boats? And why this insistence on following along the 200-meter line? Headquarters was well aware of the establishment of effective anti-submarine defenses here. Our losses were a sad testament to that. In order not to commit suicide, I decided to ignore the last part of the order and led the boat on the established course. U-953 had already covered a considerable distance. I steered the boat along the western edge of the vast minefield south of the Hebrides, dodged a large flotilla of destroyers near the North Channel, then slipped into the calm coastal waters of Western Ireland, passing familiar lighthouses. During this phase of our stealthy movement, attempts by headquarters to intensify submarine warfare in the Channel resulted in further losses. U-480 was sunk off Cape Land's End. U-927 was attacked by an airplane and sent to the bottom off the Eddystone Cliffs. This was the 13th boat lost in February. During the 17 days of snorkeling, I rotated through a strict duty schedule with Chief Mechanic Berger. Finally, U-953 rounded the southern tip of Ireland at the lighthouse on Fastnet Rock and entered the English Channel. During these days, we studied the communiques of the Wehrmacht High Command, desperately trying to find even a faint ray of hope. Alas, in vain. The tragedy of the situation intensified as our fronts collapsed, holding back the Allied advance. On March 5, American troops entered Cologne. 2 days later, they forced the Rhine at Remagen, and soon both banks of the river from Holland to Koblenz were under Allied control. In the east, the Soviet army invaded Germany with a broad front from the Baltic to Silesia, forcing thousands of soldiers and civilians to flee. While we waited for a miracle that would save our homeland, the towns where many submariners from our crew lived were overrun by the enemy. All our attempts to launch a spring offensive ended in failure. As a rule, outdated submarines, inexperienced officers, and helpless crews died on the bottom under depth bombs like animals going to slaughter. Their funeral music was played by thousands of acoustic buoys that sent false warnings of the presence of enemy destroyers. This devilish concert accompanied us every day, and in the depths of the sea, the echoes of the explosions that destroyed U-683 were still spreading as we cautiously approached Cape Lizard in southwest England on a clear sunny morning. The noise of the rumbles followed us to the outer roadstead of Falmouth Bay, where I noticed 3 destroyers patrolling. The ships zigzagged until noon, but we were protected like a shield by the high density of the water. The strong current dragging the boat into the bay also helped hide our presence. For several days we cruised in the coastal currents, trying to find suitable targets. At times the surface of the sea was only 5 meters from the boat's bridge rail, and the bottom was only 2 meters from the keel. We sneaked back and forth between Eddystone Rocks and Plymouth Bay, waiting for our chance. Above us, surface ships scored the sea, airplanes scouted, and acoustic buoys rumbled. There was no way to surface to ventilate the compartments and recharge the batteries. On March 19, we almost shared the fate of our dead friends. U-953 was lying on the ground, waiting for the end of the tide, when the faint noises of the rotating propellers increased. Before we could get off the ground, 3 destroyers came alongside our boat, lurking at a depth of only 38 meters. A series of explosions of warheads forced the boat to make 6 quick convulsive jumps, and frightened not so much the explosions themselves as the rumble that followed them. At first it seemed as if an iron chain or net had been dragged across the hull, followed by a rumble as if a huge load of cobblestones had been dropped on the boat. None of us had ever heard such a noise before, and it was a terrible, agonizing experience. What did the grinding and rumbling mean? Perhaps some new invention intended to wear us out of patience. However, I came to the conclusion, and as it turned out later, correct, that the British were using a new radar tool, similar to the Aztec. Before the thunderous roars of the first series of explosions had subsided, the Tommies began a second bombardment. It tore apart the ocean, shook the bottom, pounded the boat with powerful blows, almost bursting our eardrums and splitting the hull. However, U-953 held firm. Impulses, astic, continuously beat on the hull of the boat, but the third bombardment has already rumbled away from us. Apparently, the destroyers had come upon us by accident. Their search aids failed to show any definite outline of the boat's hull. Soon the tide carried the sea hunters out to sea. Their blind bombardment we heard for another 3 hours. March 20. U-953 was cruising off the coast at periscope depth. At 9:20 hours, I spotted a few mast tops on the east side. The acoustic instruments gave no signals. 10 minutes later, the tops of the masts lengthened, and the billows of smoke of 7 transports and 4 destroyers were clearly visible on the silvery surface of the sea. I was mesmerized by the sight, delighted at the opportunity to send a few black monsters to the bottom. I quickly gave the command. All in position, medium forward. The weeks and months of waiting for the opportunity to punish the enemy were about to be rewarded. I steered the boat in the direction of the small convoy and calculated my chances. 2 escorts went ahead of the bulky transports, and 2 others guarded it from behind. The right flank of the convoy was open to attack. Berger, on duty in the center post room, handled the boat like an experienced sailor. I was pleased with my choice of a new chief engineer. While U-953 was in an ambush, the convoy did not make any maneuvers. In order to avoid danger, he moved toward Cape Lizard or Falmouth Bay with incredible levity. Seized with the excitement of a hunter expecting easy prey, I commanded, 10 degrees to the right. All right, that's the course. I quickly looked at the horizon. There were several airplanes in the sky. Hennick was calculating the course, and the senior sailor was adjusting the counting device. Open the flaps of the torpedo tubes. Prepare to fire on targets. The new range is 2,000 meters, both engines at full speed. U-953 was running at high speed, invisible to the transports, and Gist carried via immediately attack. Then came the message that thwarted the attack. The flaps of the torpedo tubes are not opening fully. I muttered a series of curses through my teeth. Make another attempt. You must open them. Seconds passed. The boat was racing forward. The flaps can't be opened. The lever gear is bent, shouted the XO into the intercom. Try one last time. They must be open, I insisted. They're not moving at all, replied the XO, coming up to the deckhouse with a dejected look. Didn't you check the flaps when we hit the rock? I did, and they opened properly then. In anger and despair, now knowing for sure that the XO had not checked the flaps, I put the boat on the ground. Then I rushed to the forward compartment, hoping to make it right. Several sailors were still trying to turn the levers, but the flaps and covers remained in the half-open position. The accident had not only deprived us of hope of a successful attack, but also made it pointless to continue patrolling. In fact, we had never before encountered a worse situation. With the outer flaps of the torpedo tubes half opened, the inner ones remained the only barrier to seawater entering the boat. However, they were too fragile to withstand the shock waves from the explosions of the depth bombs. I remembered the case of the air raid on Brest, when a single aerial bomb that exploded at a distance of 50 meters from our submarine broke the inner flap, although the outer one was tightly closed. I felt a chill run down my back. The bombardment we had experienced the day before would have easily blown the flaps off and caused the boat to sink within seconds. Grievous that I had taken the XO's earlier assurances of the boat's perfect condition on faith, that I had not personally checked the condition of the lever mechanism while still at the dock, I now faced the dubious prospect of a safe return to Norway. With grim determination, I prepared to sail through the deadly coastal waters of England and Ireland with only one serviceable torpedo apparatus. When the tide began to ebb, I took the boat off the ground and steered westward. The specter of death hovered before our eyes as the depth bombs exploded off the starboard bow near Cape Lizard. They destroyed the U-327. That day proved fatal for the other 2 subs as well. In the North Channel was sunk U-1003, and near the Hebrides Islands, U-905. The battle continued with one-sided losses for us. The enemy methodically destroyed our subs, one a day. The sudden bombardments that met our newcomers in the North Channel near Cape Land's End and Lizards seemed to me a clear indication that the British had been informed of our operations in advance. Just during these weeks of our terrible self-destruction, I lost one of my closest friends and fellow students. Riedel, who commanded the U-242, died somewhere off the coast of England during his first combat tour as a submarine commander. She sank without giving a distress signal. No one knows exactly where his steel coffin went down. We passed the North Channel, skirted the Hebrides Islands, and cautiously proceeded onward through calm seas at Schmerkel depth. On the way, we snuck through cordons of destroyers, especially numerous off the Shetland Islands, then overcame the last line of anti-submarine defense of the British in the Norwegian Sea. When U-953 approached the Scandinavian mountain peaks, the Allies stopped hunting for us. U-953 entered the Bergen Fjord in a submerged position, without signaling her arrival to the escort. We surfaced, full of despair, showing nothing as trophies after our long and harrowing trek, nothing but our lives. As U-953, aged and rusty, secured her moorings on the pier, heavy gray clouds covered the sky. We arrived in port at 4:10 p.m. on April 7, 1945. No one was waiting or greeting us. As soon as the boat crew reached the apartment complex, it began to drizzle. Bergen and the surrounding hills disappeared behind its veil. The evening came, full of gloomy forebodings. The commander of the 11th Submarine Flotilla hastily organized an evening reception for us. I reported that the trip had been fruitless and that we had barely escaped. I also informed him that the enemy convoy had passed by our faulty torpedo tubes in perfect safety. "There is always another reason to attack," said the commander sympathetically. "The English won't just disappear. During the next campaign, you will have to hit a lot of targets." He assured me that success was ahead of us. Submarines of the latest designs should arrive any day now, and the usual ones, which were used in training divisions, are already arriving in ports in large numbers. The feast dragged on. We discussed professional topics without touching the German situation. I had been awake for 5 days, and having not rested for nearly 7 weeks, had an overwhelming need for sleep. When I noticed that my submariners were getting drunk on strong drinks, I rose abruptly, signaling that the feast was over. The next morning, I sent U-953 to the shipyards for a thorough examination. Her breakdowns turned out to be more serious than we had anticipated. Since a dry dock was required for serious repairs, it was decided to ship her to Trondheim. Having drawn up a memo containing new evidence of the necessity of replacing the chief engineer, I took with me the logbook, navigational charts, and went to the senior officer of the Headquarters Division West. I was met by a nervous man in an immaculately pressed naval uniform. Anxiety replaced on his face haughty, ruthless expression, which he showed us in May 1944 before the landing of the Allies. Without preamble, I asked him for a replacement for my chief engineer. "We do not have naval officers of the qualifications you need," said this representative of the staff. "There are very few of them. I suggest you train Zelda in the fjord before the new campaign. Herr Captain, I have been patient enough and tried many times to teach him how to steer the boat. He's just not capable of it. My XO was acting as chief engineer on the trip. Zeld would never have gotten us back to port." The staffer grouchily promised that he would look into the situation. I left his office with the feeling that the problem had never been solved. The denouement came the next day, when I was preparing the crew and boat for the passage to Trondheim. As dusk approached, I was called to the staff officer. "Your chief engineer has been to see me," he began the conversation. "Zeld complained that you kept him in the officer's room for most of the campaign. Why did you resort to such a cruel measure and say nothing to me about it?" "Herr Captain, it was done in the interest of safety. I didn't mention this episode because I didn't consider it relevant. On the contrary, the matter is quite serious. It changes the whole case. I now understand what it is. Of course, I can't approve of your actions. Is that not clear? Let me remind you, Herr Captain, that a commander's responsibility begins with the safety of the crew and the boat. When that comes into question, the commander has the right to make whatever decisions he deems necessary. As commander, I did so in the best interest of the boat and crew. All of this stays with you, but you should not have resorted to such a cruel decision. It's all clear to me now. We'll replace your chief engineer. Despite the fact that I had to leave for Trondheim as soon as possible, the staff officer gave me a long lecture. He said that about 60 old-type submarines were being prepared for shipment to the front. More importantly, 80 submarines of the latest design of large displacement and 40 of small displacement were about to finish their training tours and would be ready in 2 weeks at the latest for an unprecedented counteroffensive. Soon more than 150 submarines would surround the British Isles and cut off the supply lines of the Allied forces on the continent. I listened to this news with great enthusiasm. However, it was not so simple. According to Rosing, Germany will be reborn in a matter of weeks. I wondered if he had heard the latest army reports. That same evening on April 11, the U-953 left Bergen Bay. She had on board a pilot, a Coast Guard lieutenant familiar with the difficult navigational conditions in the Norwegian fjords. Moving along the dark surface of the sea, U-953 took a course to the north, daring to pass by British torpedo boats that had penetrated the fjords and had already sunk several of our ships. 3 nights we looped through narrow fairways in total darkness. We passed by reefs with minimum clearance and almost perished near Helitsoy, where U-486 was torpedoed the night before. We rounded Olsuna Bay, barely avoiding the danger of hitting rocks at high tide by forcing the diesels into reverse. Next, the boat dodged off the coastal rocks into the sea, coming under fire from radar pulses, and slipped into a through passage in the rock, beyond which was another fjord. Near Smila Island, we again almost hit the rocks, where the Norwegians tried to replace us with the light of a false beacon. And so at the end of the 3rd night the boat arrived in Trondheim, where it moored at the parking lot in a concrete bunker. This happened at 600 on April 14. Since it was still too early an hour to visit the residence of the commanding officers of the 13th Submarine Flotilla, settle the crew arrangements, and put U-953 into dry dock, I decided to have a drink. The radio receiver was tuned to a German radio station, and light music poured into the compartments. I was sipping coffee from a cup in my small cabin when the music was interrupted by the announcer's voice. Attention! Listen to the special news bulletin. We're broadcasting important news. When the music resumed, my fatigue was lifted. A special newscast usually meant good news. I couldn't imagine what event could have encouraged us at this time. Only the previous night we had learned that our industrial district of Ruhr was surrounded by the Allies. The British were approaching Hamburg. The Americans had captured Darmstadt, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart. The French had occupied the Black Forest, and the Russians had taken Vienna and were storming Berlin. If Germany could be saved by a miracle, it had to shock the imagination. But then the music stopped, and an announcer's voice sounded. Listen to the special news bulletin. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12. Providence has eliminated one of our country's worst enemies. Providence is on the side of the German people. Roosevelt's death will have far-reaching consequences. Very soon, Allied unity will be shaken, and the war will take a turn favorable to us. I repeat, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in the United States. The announcer's voice sank into the bravura sounds of a military march. My submariners, silently listening to the radio, continued their breakfast. Evidently, the news did not seem important enough to divert their attention from the problems of duty, home, and family. Personally, I did not see Roosevelt's death as anything reassuring for Germany. The former President of the United States would be replaced by another figure who would continue his ruthless course. The victorious Allied armies would not simply turn back and abandon the battlefield. The flotilla compounds, once instrumental in submarine warfare in the Arctic, were quite modest in size. I did not meet anyone I knew there. After reporting our arrival, I arranged for the crew to be housed in the barracks. Moving from the boat to the housing complex was easy. A toothbrush, some underwear, and a submarine work robe were all that went into our personal belongings. To keep abreast of events, I had brought a shortwave receiver from the boat to my room. The news from the front made me think of the places where I had spent my youth, of Frankfurt, the Black Forest, which together with their German populations had already fallen under Allied control. Yes, and the rest of Germany was sandwiched between two powerful forces, and its defense took on such a desperate character that teenagers, old men and old women, were advised to use teeth, nails, and patrons as a last resort against the aggressor. My war was drawing to a close, as was the war of all Germany. On April 17, I was notified that the boat had sustained damage that was almost impossible to repair. The bow torpedo tubes had lost their adjustment mechanism from the impact with the rock, and it had to be recreated. This lengthy and complicated type of repair work was going to delay our going to sea for a long time. Worst of all, it was impossible to use the dry dock for some time. My irritation was growing. With sudden and tragic clarity, I realized that the war was lost. Everything that was happening around me convinced me of this. I was already imagining how we would end up in a huge prisoner of war camp, at the mercy of ruthless enemies. We would be reduced to a savage, bestial state from which there would be no escape but starvation. And yet, it seemed to me, there was a way of escape. There, at the edge of the sea, stood my boat. When it had been repaired, I could sail it to South America, to Uruguay or Argentina, for example. Escape by boat suddenly seemed the only way out. What luck that I had managed to save my boat for the last trip. The sudden insight instantly turned into thinking of a plan to put it into action. I sent Hennig to get the appropriate navigational charts without revealing my intentions to him. For several days in the evenings I stayed in my room and, leaning over the maps, plotted my escape route. I weighed my chances of reaching the Rio de la Plata, expecting to reduce the crew to a minimum of only reliable, loyal, single men, thus eliminating treason. I knew I could rely on most of the crew, but I doubted the officers. The chief engineer had been transferred to another duty station. A new appointee unfamiliar with the crew would be a serious liability. The same applied to the XO and the cadet, both too young to understand the situation. I outlined a few key coworkers that I would involve in my plot first. Only a few, because I was playing a dangerous game. It was a challenge not only to my superiors, but also to that core of hard-headed military men who were in favor of turning Norway into a fortress and starting their own war for a phantom victory. Meanwhile, our resistance in Italy, Austria, and Germany had been broken. Now only a madman could speak of a turning point in the war in our favor. But oaths, patriotism, and discipline were so ingrained in the Germans that many quite sensible men sacrificed their lives for a hopeless cause. Among them were submarine commanders and crews. They were sunk 2 or 3 a day as they left Bergen, Kristiansund, and Kiel on their first and last voyage. Hundreds of fine men died for nothing, only in the name of loyalty to duty and the Reich. On April 27, U-953 was still at the pier, and it seemed that she would not at all undergo the repairs necessary for the realization of my plan. Then I was unexpectedly summoned to see the staff officer at Bergen. Puzzled by the urgent summons, I prepared for a long train ride across half of Norway. Since I had nothing with me but a submariner's uniform, inappropriate for the trip, I borrowed a ski suit from the base. Such suits were used at the best of times by those vacationing in the mountains of Norway. Dressed in blue ski pants and a light gray hooded jacket, carrying a backpack with 4 days' worth of food, I left Trondheim and set off on a journey through the snow-covered mountains. On the afternoon of April 30, the train arrived at the Bergen station. From memory, I managed to track down the compound. When I got to my room, I felt like a foreigner in a hotel. At 8:30 on Tuesday, May 1, I knocked on the door of the staff officer's office. Permission to report. I am here on your orders, Herr Captain. Your arrival was expected yesterday. Rosing said dryly. Herr Captain, I tried to arrive as soon as possible. Well, it doesn't matter. Your submarine cannot be repaired by the beginning of our offensive, and the front needs every experienced sailor. You'll have to take command of another sub ready to go to sea. She should arrive soon from the German port of Christiansand. Yes, Herr Captain. You must show will and determination in the fight against England. Admiral Dönitz has ordered the transfer of all U-boats from Germany to Norway. We will continue the war at sea from here. Surrender is out of the question. We will stand our ground and impose our terms on the enemy. Rosing handed me an order to report to the commander of the 27th Flotilla, and then continued. I want to use you also as a courier. Several secret documents will be sent with you, which you will deliver to our bases in Oslo, Orten, and Kristiansand. I expect the documents will be ready at noon. I was too excited to reply. Truly, there was no limit to the madness. Clicking my heels, I turned and left the office. Leaving Rosing, I clenched my teeth in frustration. My splendid plan of escape was suddenly impossible. But then I cheered up again. A new submarine, ready to go, would give me a more favorable chance of reaching South America quickly. The decision to flee became even stronger as soon as I remembered HQ's meaningless plans to wage war at sea until the last submariner had gone down. The impact of Dönitz's order was already being felt. At the base and in the harbor, the last preparations were unfolding to send the remaining boats on their fateful voyage. Mechanics and dockworkers worked so selflessly and tensely, as if the salvation of the Reich depended on their efforts. Meanwhile, staggering news spread through the compound. The latest communique of the High Command indicated that the battle for Berlin has entered a decisive phase. Hitler has taken command of the troops defending the capital. At 19:00, I received the secret documents I had been waiting for. By this time, it was too late to leave, so I had a modest dinner in the officers' mess and went to sleep it off before the trip to Kristiansand. Stretched out on my bed, I turned on the radio and waited for the news. Finally, the music stopped. The announcer's voice, rattling at first, then loud and hoarse, interrupted the short pause. Attention! Listen to an important message. Instantly, my drowsiness faded away. I glanced at the clock. 21:30. A piece of music from Wagner's opera was playing on the radio, portending gloomy news. I assumed they would report the fall of Berlin, and even that the ceasefire had prevented needless casualties. But then the announcer spoke again in a low and solemn voice. Our Führer, Adolf Hitler, who fought to his last breath, died a brave death for Germany at his headquarters in the Reich Chancellery. On April 30, the Führer appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz as his deputy. The Grand Admiral, the Führer's successor, now addresses the German people. This was the final act of the tragedy. The end of our agony, the end of the war, and the end of German history. The most impossible event had come to pass. Hitler's death could only lead to final defeat. I could hardly distinguish Dönitz's voice. He was saying that the armed struggle must continue to save the lives of millions of refugees. The Germans must fight and protect their families. His words were drowned out by the melody of the national anthem. I was overwhelmed by an overwhelming sadness. Together with 10 million Germans, I had given up everything I had, everything I loved and cherished. For the sake of my country and victory, I sacrificed my home and family. I blindly believed in the common cause, fought, hoped, suffered, and waited for a miracle in deep devotion to the national idea. And now it is all over. A total collapse has come. Dejected, I dragged myself to the officers' mess hall. There sat the flotilla commander and a number of officers, discouraged, saddened, pale. He died on the barricades. We must carry on his work, said a voice. Someone else exclaimed. He gave us an example. We must hold on and continue the war here in Norway. It will take the Allies a hell of a long time to smoke us out of these mountains. Third spoke cautiously, suggesting that the end of the war had come. The exchange of views soon stopped because of a general sense of hopelessness. We scattered to our corners. The next morning, May 2, I boarded a train that took me to Oslo in the late afternoon. On May 3, I delivered the envelope with the secret documents to the right address, and then took the train to Horten. There I handed the second package to the adjutant of the Navy base commander and continued my journey by rail to my final destination. On May 4 at about 700 I arrived in Kristiansund after a sleepless night spent on the wooden bench of an unheated wagon. A blue sky dome hung over the city. I wandered along a narrow, dusty road through a grove of pine trees and a thicket of low fir trees to the vast complex of buildings of the naval base. At 8:30 I entered the building that housed the spacious offices of the flotilla command representatives. A young adjutant led me to the flotilla commander. From behind the desk rose a naval officer with awards on his chest. He had been a submarine commander when the convoy hunt was still successful. Captain Jurgensen is one of the lucky ones, who was recalled from the front at the right time, helped to avoid disaster. Herr Captain, I've arrived at your disposal. Oh yes, I was informed of your arrival. You are to take command of a new submarine. It hasn't arrived yet, but it's expected any day now. In the meantime, why don't you make yourself comfortable with us? I'll let you know. That'll be all for now. This brief, polite reception gave me a strange feeling. There was something artificial in Jurgensen's demeanor. Something else lurked behind the expression of concern on his face. He seemed distracted and agitated. I left his office in the full belief that Jurgensen knew of our misfortune, but did not want to reveal it. As I hurried to the pier, I saw two old submarines bobbing about. Next to them was a new type of boat of small displacement. As I approached, I saw the captain's white cap, then his face over the bridge rail. "Angerman, is that you?" I shouted to the commander from the pier. "Hey, are you still alive?" He responded. "The bad grass grows," I said in a proverb. "Is one of these wrecks yours?" he asked, pointing to the old boats. "No, I have to take command of a new boat that will be here soon. I don't want to disappoint you, but the sea is hell. I'm afraid your boat can't get here. We've just crossed the Skagerrak, so I speak with full knowledge. The sky is black with their planes. Germany is a total rout. Berlin has been taken by the Soviets. The Americans met them on the Elbe. We were leaving Kiel when the guns came at us with direct fire." He wiped the sweat off his face and continued. "The Tommies captured Kiel. The first British tanks appeared on the Tirpitz Pier when we were in the middle of the inner bay. They started firing at us, and by golly, it was a miracle we got here. We lost at least 7 boats during the crossing. I stopped counting losses just this morning. I'm sure it can't go on like this for much longer." Angerman was still talking about the horrors he had experienced when another small submarine of a new design approached the pier. One of the sailors dropped the moorings. At that moment I recognized another familiar face. My old friend Fred Schreiber had also escaped death in the Baltic. Fred waved his hand in greeting. His sparkling eyes had lost their former vivacity. His skin was ash-colored. I realized that disaster had struck. As soon as the gangplank was thrown over, I rushed to meet my friend. We shook hands in silence. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. Schreiber's eyes moistened. I unfolded the piece of paper. It was a decrypted radiogram from headquarters. "Attention all submarines. Cease fire immediately. Cease all combat operations against Allied vessels. Dönitz." When I read the text of the radiogram, the letters were blurred. I could barely hear Fred's voice. "We received it half an hour ago. This is the final." My heart suddenly ached. I turned away to hold back the tears. I wasn't trained to lose. By May 5th, the submarine war was over. Dönitz, the head of the new government, had agreed to the preconditions for the surrender of all our armed forces in Northern Europe. The next day, the naval base was roused by another radiogram from Dönitz. The admiral who had led our submarine fleet to glory and tragedy mourned the duty-bound sailors lying on the ocean floor and thanked those who had survived the terrible battles. "My submariners, you have 6 years of war behind you. You fought like lions. The overwhelming superiority of the enemy has driven us into a tight corner from which it is impossible to continue the fight. Undefeated and untarnished, you laid down your arms after a heroic battle without precedent. We proudly remember our fallen comrades who sacrificed their lives for the Führer and the fatherland. Friends, keep the courage with which you fought so long and with honor for a better future for the fatherland. Long live Germany, your Grand Admiral. This was the message that ended our suffering. For the first time, it recognized our defeat. The destruction of human beings was finally over. From now on, the fear of losing our lives ignominiously would be gone. An unfamiliar sense of peace swept over me as I realized I had survived. Long condemned to death in a steel coffin, escaped annihilation. The feeling of life was so wonderful that it was like a dream come true.